Hi, welcome back. I'm Jack Berkowitz. I'm the Chief Data Officer of Securiti.ai. We're a company that specializes in data and AI governance and also security and all things that are going on now with generative AI and data, making sure that people can use this stuff safely. With me today is Prasanna from VW Credit. I'm going to let her introduce herself in just a second and explain about her job. And then we're going to talk a little bit about AI governance and all the issues and opportunities that are there. So, Prasanna, welcome. And why don't you introduce yourself and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you for inviting me today. It's a pleasure talking with you today. And I'm Prasannal Nithyanandam. I head our data and advanced analytics at VWFS. It's a fun job that I have that to balance both technology and driving the business value, something which excites me, right? And we are in this cross section of what this disruptive technology could bring to the table, and being a data leader in the last 2 decades, it's never a time, an opportune time. So I'm excited about
Okay.
where we are.
Yeah, and awesome. And I'm excited because, I've used your services. I have a couple of cars actually. So it's nice to be talking to somebody as a customer and not just as, a vendor or partner. Anyway, let's get into it. So, we met, I want to say 6 months ago now when I was in Chicago at a CDO magazine dinner, actually. And, the topic there was about this emerging capability of AI governance, right? AI governance for conventional models, AI governance for generative AI models. Since we last talked, there's been an explosion of concerns about Copilot, the data that could go into Copilots, whether it's a Microsoft Copilot or OpenAI or whatever happens to be. So maybe talk to us about the journey that you've been on at VW Financial Services about this, and we'll start there.
Yeah, Jack. So I think, as you mentioned, AI itself is not new, right? Like we've been in traditional AI for years now. We do have a heavy use cases with machine learning, whether it's an off-lease pricing model or fraud detection. Just as you mentioned, I think as we came across last year in heavy intersection, coming up with the opportunities with generative AI, our first response to that was like, what would be an acceptable use of AI? I think we as an organization had to recognize that, hey, there is so much out there, not to with the employees especially, how can we equip them with the right information and give them the guidance. So we started with first setting up an AI policy, what an acceptable use meant. The second step is setting up a working group. We set up an AI working group. With this AI technology in place, it's much more than a technology risk mitigation. Then it opens up a much more collaboration, whether it's your secure infosec, legal teams, privacy, compliance, data as scientists, which is my team and group. So this kind of important to come across. Like we just established a working group, so that we have the right SMEs in the room to address the various aspects, and especially AI governance is, I would say, a still kind of improved our foundation from data governance. So we have a data governance framework, but we were expecting like how do we expand that framework farther than just data. So we just started with establishing that working group, and third we went into the space of being able to give a framework for the organization. So let me stop there, and we can just talk about individual steps. But I think it was just establishing a policy and be able to rally the cross-functional teams and set up a AI working group was critical
Yeah,
for us.
well, and I really think that's the key, right? This notion that the borders between all of these groups, which in any company has, you know, well, I'm responsible for X and you're responsible for Y, and the people down the hall are responsible for Z. Kind of all those lines get blurred now, right? Because it used to be, hey, the analytics team will handle the data and the legal team will go handle, something else, regulations or whatever it happens to be, and there'll be a compliance team and a privacy team and everything else. And there were teams, but now when this data is in motion and these models are alive, whatever they happen to be, things change, right? So whether you're building a chatbot, whether people are using a co-pilot for advice on how to write a PowerPoint. I was using like a Copilot the other day just for like formatting and telling a story. These things are alive, and it is that collaboration between people. So how have you seen that evolve?
So yeah, I mean, from establishing the policy and the working group, I think the next step we approached it was like, what is the inventory, right? Like we wanted to start with where are the AI is being currently used. And I know, as I said, like we have a machine learning platform, we have, say, UiPath where RPAs and bots are running, and so we wanted to take a good lens about like what are existing toolkit within our environment. And then the next step we wanted to go was to how do we enable Microsoft Copilot? Because there was this various appetite coming from the business and our own employees for productivity, right? Like, I think if anything, we wanted to prioritize internal facing use cases and employee productivity. So we kind of still kind of established a risk assessment based on the NIST framework, so that we just went through the use cases. We established a questionnaire and making sure we have a general risk model guidance of like low, high, medium. So we just scored them, and based on whether it's a low and medium, this group kind of provided the recommendation whether to go forward and approve the usage of Microsoft Copilot as an example. So we kind of started from there, starting building these building blocks in terms of whether it's a risk assessment, what kind of process and procedures needs to be in place, and especially as you said, Jack, there's so much which is already like we have a data sharing, we have a data privacy assessments and existing vendor risk assessments. So what we had to retrospect was take a look at our current gates, right? Like when we onboard a solution, and what does it take to the vendor risk assessment that we already have? How do we embed asking these AI specific risks questionnaire in the existing process, right? So that we don't create completely a new process, but we want to make sure we are asking the business and the teams the right question as they are onboarding new program, new project. So I think that was critical for us to build that questionnaire and be able to see what are the right gates that we could start introducing so that we could learn more. So one is to go think about forward, what's happening now, then go back retrospectively what we have in our four walls, which is a discovery. So I thought we will start with, at least let's start capturing now what the initiative
Yeah.
for this year, and
y-
then go from there.
So that's so interesting because you know, when looking at the inventory, when you have to go back and you have to look at, all those systems that maybe you have in place and documenting them and just making sure you understand what data is flowing where, what models are in place, or maybe it's not even a model, it's just a lineage of the data. But then if you're using like a third party system that's a SaaS system, people are adding capabilities to those old things. So even if you think you have an inventory, right? You may not
Absolutely.
actually know where all the AI is because, you're using, I don't know, Salesforce, and Salesforce introduces a new capability.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so understanding that inventory is a massive amount of work.
Right. And I think you're spot on when you talked about vendor solution, Jack, especially, right? It's easier when you think about, oh, your platform is AWS, public cloud, and your GCP or Azure, because even your Securiti can connect to these native public clouds versus the private cloud or these SaaS solutions. It's hard to introspect. I mean, there is no way to introspect what the vendor solution is dealing with. And I think that's one of our thought process is to like still ask the relevant questions to them to certify, right? Like, are you certified for X, Y, and Z? Are you certified for, how do you prove the evidence? Because when the auditor is coming, it's up to the organization still to defend. We cannot transfer the risk to the vendor to just say like, hey, it's just a vendor solution, right? So I think we are also focusing on what are the right set of questions and evidence that we need to start collecting when we are dealing with vendors.
Yeah, I love that point, and it's something a lot of people miss. People are like, "Well, I don't know." It's like, "Well, isn't it your business? You're choosing to bring companies in, you're choosing to use these tools, and you just can't sort of push off." And in fact, if to your point, you were saying you were using the NIST guidance, the NIST guidance makes this clear. Certainly, the EU AI Act for people in Europe or people that are working in transnational corporations, multinational corporations. The EU Act makes that very clear. You have to take responsibility for what you're doing. Now, you may have different levels of severity that you need to think about in these different AI systems, and that's great, but it doesn't mean you put your head in the sand, right?
Right.
You have a responsibility to your employees, to your customers, to your shareholders if you're a public
Yeah.
company,
Yeah.
and it's a responsibility that you need to deal with. Yeah.
Right. And I think it's just more about putting the customer's trust and loyalty, right? If anybody asks like any of these decisions, end of the day is like the risk is in light of like, is it worth my customers trust, right? Like, and the customer experience. So putting them in the center of it, which was already the goal of a data privacy program, I think this only amplifies the need of it even more. And I think as we see these regulations, whether it's a Colorado Act or Utah AI Act, we are seeing the similar path, like what data privacy took in terms of from California to 25 states now. And we can see that that's what is going to be happening with AI as well. The regulations are going to get even more tougher. And I think we recognize, yeah, that there's a NIST framework to start with, the controls that we could start testing and making sure we are complying. But I think the moment it's going to explode with variations from state to state and whatnot, it is important to retrospect our toolkit as well to see like what else is required, just more than just a data lineage. How do I satisfy and prove that we are we are not violating any of these controls in place? And I think it's very expensive to do that manually, and having tools to have the alerts and monitoring will help the organizations to stay on top of it.
That's awesome. In fact, why don't we wrap right there? Because it gives me a perfect opportunity to give a little commercial. Now, I've been running this series for a year and I haven't really done too many commercials, but I'll do a commercial here. Security really does build a system that does that. It's an active monitoring of your information. It all comes together in what we call the data command graph, which shows you the interaction between people and data and models and regulations. And you can put a control in place and see which regulations you meet. And over time, how are you doing about improving either your compliance to regulations or reducing your risk? I think the part Prasanna hit on at the end, which is so important, which is essentially this. It's not just about checking the regulation, but it's earning that trust with your customer. And what happens if that trust gets violated, right? And used to be, oh, well, that's a privacy concern, and we'll deal with fines about privacy. But now when you're looking at the data landscape and the AI landscape, it's fundamental. So we even have a little bit of a value calculator that we use to help people understand, hey, this is what happens in a data breach. Here's the regulatory fines that you may have to pay, but here's the business value implications. Here's the effect on share price, the effect on operational costs, and all the other things that actually make some sense. So, look, at that note, why don't we wrap? It's been my pleasure. I always enjoy talking with you. This has been fantastic. Thank you all so much. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you for your time today. Yeah.